For 6 months, a frail woman braved freezing rain and biting wind to sleep on the dirt of a notorious outlaw's grave. When 1,000 Hell's Angels rode in to forcefully evict her, they expected a crazy groupie. Instead, her single, terrifying confession brought the toughest men alive to tears. Oak Hill Memorial Cemetery sat on the desolate, wind-battered outskirts of Billings, Montana. It was a sprawling graveyard where the frost settled early in October and the ground stayed frozen solid well into April. In the furthest corner, completely isolated from the manicured family plots and weeping angel statues, lay Section D. It was the barren stretch of dirt reserved for the city's outcasts, the unclaimed and the disgraced. And in Plot 404, beneath the twisted, leafless branches of a dying oak tree, lay Arthur Caldwell. To the local police, Arthur was a career criminal. To the Billings chapter of the Hells Angels, he was known simply as Grim. Standing 6'4" and built like a freight train, Grim had been the club's most feared enforcer. He was a man composed entirely of scar tissue, faded prison ink, and quiet, terrifying violence. For 20 years, Grim's word was absolute law on the streets, but 3 years ago, Grim died in a hail of gunfire in an abandoned rail yard, and he died in absolute disgrace. In the months leading up to his death, over $200,000 of club funds had mysteriously vanished. Grim had been missing meetings, disappearing for days at a time, and dodging calls from his club brothers. The streets whispered that the great enforcer had finally broken, that he was skimming money to feed a secret narcotic addiction, or worse, that he was cutting a deal with the federal government to save himself from a looming RICO indictment. When his bullet-riddled body was found, the club felt nothing but cold betrayal. There was no legendary biker funeral, no roaring procession of 1,000 motorcycles, no colors draped over a polished casket. The Hells Angels simply tossed him in a cheap pine box, buried him in the unhallowed dirt of Section D, and strictly forbade any member from ever speaking his name again. That was the absolute end of Arthur Caldwell's legacy. Until Clara Mitchell arrived. Clara was 68 years old, a retired elementary school teacher with a shock of silver hair, severe arthritis, and the frail, bird-like posture of a woman who had seen too many harsh winters. She drove a rusted 1998 Ford Taurus, and every single evening, exactly as the clock struck 8, her headlights would pierce the graveyard's fog. The cemetery groundskeeper, an anxious man named Gary Hobbs, first noticed her in early November. He watched from his heated maintenance shed as Clara trudged through the freezing sleet, carrying a heavy canvas sleeping bag, a thermos of black tea, and a small battery-powered camping lantern. Gary assumed she was visiting a late husband, but when he tracked her footprints the next morning, he felt a cold spike of dread in his stomach. The prints led directly to the unmarked, sunken dirt of Grim's grave. By December, Clara's nightly vigil had become an immovable ritual. No matter the weather, whether it was a torrential downpour or a blinding snowstorm, Clara would lay her sleeping bag directly over the frozen earth of the outlaw's resting place and sleep there until dawn. Terrified of the Hells Angels' reputation, Gary eventually mustered the courage to confront her. One bitterly cold Tuesday, he marched up to Section D, his breath pluming in the icy air. "Ma'am, you can't be here," Gary pleaded, shivering in his heavy parka. "The grounds are closed after dusk. And, well, do you have any idea whose grave you're sleeping on? That man was a monster. His associates are dangerous people." Clara didn't flinch. She sat on her sleeping bag, pouring a cup of steaming tea. She looked up at Gary with eyes that were terrifyingly calm, the eyes of a woman who had already survived the worst the world had to offer. "I know exactly whose grave this is, Mr. Hobbs," Clara said, her voice soft but entirely devoid of fear. "And I sleep here because this plot of dirt is the only place in the entire world where the real monsters can no longer touch me." Gary backed away and immediately called the local police. But when the Billings PD heard she was camping on a disgraced Hells Angels grave, they refused to intervene. "Let the bikers handle their own messes," the dispatcher scoffed. Inevitably, the whispers bled out of the graveyard and into the streets, eventually reaching the heavy, smoke-stained doors of the Hells Angels clubhouse. Richard "Brick" Henderson, the formidable president of the Billings chapter, was sitting at the head of the chapter table when he heard the rumor. Brick was a massive, bearded veteran who ruled the club with an iron fist. He had once considered Grim his closest brother, which made Grim's ultimate betrayal burn all the more intensely. When a prospect mentioned that some crazy old woman was turning Grim's grave into a shrine, the clubhouse fell dead silent. To the club, it was a profound insult, a mockery of their patch. "Send Wyatt and Dave," Brick growled, not even looking up from his ledger. "Tell them to go down to Oak Hill tonight. I don't care if she's a groupie, a junkie, or just out of her mind. Run her off. If she doesn't leave, burn her sleeping bag and drag her out by her ankles." That night, the guttural roar of 2 customized Harley-Davidsons shattered the peace of the cemetery. Prospects Wyatt and Dave, 2 hulking men eager to earn their full patches, rode directly over the frosted grass, stopping their heavy bikes inches from Clara's sleeping bag. The blinding glare of their high beams illuminated the frail woman. "Time's up, Grandma," Wyatt barked, stepping off his bike and cracking his heavy leather knuckles. "You're disrespecting club property. You've got 60 seconds to pack your trash and walk, or I'm throwing you in the back of your own trunk." Clara didn't move to run. She slowly screwed the cap onto her thermos, stood up, and walked directly into the blinding headlights. She stopped mere inches from Wyatt's chest, staring up at the towering biker. "You boys wear the same winged death head that he did," Clara said quietly, her voice cutting through the rumbling of the engines. "But you don't carry a fraction of his weight. You go back to your clubhouse. You tell Richard Henderson that if he wants me off this dirt, he has to come here and look me in the eye himself." Wyatt stepped back, completely unnerved by the absolute, chilling authority in the old woman's voice. Outlaws thrived on fear, but this frail grandmother had none left to give. Confused and unsettled, the prospects backed off, kicking their bikes into gear and speeding back to the clubhouse. When Brick heard their report, his blood boiled. This wasn't just a nuisance anymore. It was a direct challenge to his leadership, and he was going to crush it. The timing could not have been worse for a public challenge. It was the weekend of the annual Northwestern Run. The Billings chapter was hosting over 1,000 Hells Angels from across the country. Charters from Oakland, Seattle, Denver, and the nomadic factions had flooded the city. The hotels were booked solid. The bars were overflowing with leather and denim, and the streets constantly vibrated with the mechanical thunder of V-twin engines. The story of the defiant old woman sleeping on the traitor's grave had spread through the visiting chapters like a wildfire. It became a point of intense contention. The president of the powerful Oakland chapter pulled Brick aside and bluntly asked why the Billings charter was too weak to handle a trespassing grandmother. It was no longer just about Grim. It was about the absolute respect and authority of the Hells Angels. Brick's pride could not take the insult. He decided that tonight he would make a public spectacle of the eviction. He would show the entire Brotherhood that no one, living or dead, young or old, disrespected their club. At 9 p.m., the city of Billings trembled. A massive, coordinated convoy departed from the clubhouse. Over 1,000 Harleys formed a miles-long parade of roaring chrome and roaring exhaust rolling through the freezing night streets. The sheer magnitude of the procession was terrifying. Traffic stopped. Pedestrians backed into alleyways. The synchronized thunder of the engines sounded like a low-flying squadron of heavy bombers. They reached Oak Hill Memorial Cemetery, pouring through the iron gates like a tidal wave of leather and denim. The bikes completely surrounded Section D, forming a massive, unbroken perimeter of blazing headlights that turned the pitch-black graveyard into the middle of the day. The air instantly filled with the heavy scent of high-octane fuel, exhaust, and stale cigarette smoke. Over 1,000 outlaws dismounted, their heavy boots crunching loudly against the frosted grass. They stood in absolute intimidating silence, a wall of hardened men, waiting to see how their brother would handle the insult. Brick Henderson unbuckled his heavy leather jacket and walked down the center aisle created by the bikes. He was flanked by his sergeant-at-arms and 5 of his largest enforcers. In the center of the blinding ring of light, sitting on her cheap canvas sleeping bag, was Clara Mitchell. The frost had settled on her wool coat, but she sat perfectly upright. She did not tremble. She did not cry. Brick stopped 10 feet from the grave. He looked down at the unmarked dirt, his face twisting in disgust, before turning his cold gaze to Clara. "Lady, I don't know what kind of sick game you're playing." Brick's voice boomed, echoing across the silent graveyard, so every biker could hear. "But it ends right now. That man in the dirt was a rat. He was a thief who stole from his own brothers. We don't need you making a shrine out of our greatest mistake. You're leaving this cemetery forever, or I swear to God, we are going to bury you right next to him." Clara stood up. Her arthritic knees popped in the cold, but she straightened her spine. She looked at the 1,000 heavily armed men surrounding her, and then she looked directly into Brick's furious eyes. "You call him a traitor, Richard," Clara said, her voice remarkably clear, carrying over the idling engines. "Because of the missing $200,000? Because of the nights he vanished? Because he died completely alone in that rail yard?" Brick's jaw tightened. "He stole from us to save his own neck. He died a coward." "No," Clara said, shaking her head slowly. "He died a king, and he died to save yours." Clara reached deep into the pockets of her heavy wool coat. A dozen bikers instinctively reached for the weapons on their belts, but Brick held up a massive hand, stopping them. Clara pulled out 2 items. The first was a thick, weathered ledger book. The second was a piece of heavy, blood-stained leather. It was a club cut, specifically the bottom rocker patch that read Montana. It was the very patch the club had noted was missing from Grimm's body when the coroner found him. She tossed the ledger and the bloodied patch. They landed squarely at Brick's heavy boots. "My name is Clara Mitchell," she began, the wind whipping her silver hair across her face. "I don't exist on any government grid. For the last 20 years, I ran a clandestine underground shelter called the Harbor House, hidden in the foothills just outside of town. We took in the women and children that the law ignored, women fleeing from the Volkov syndicate." A low murmur rippled through the 1,000 bikers. Every man there knew the Volkovs. They were a hyper-violent, heavily armed Russian human trafficking ring. The Hells Angels had a strict, unspoken treaty with the syndicate. Stay out of each other's way, because a war between them would turn the streets into a bloodbath and bring the full, crushing weight of the FBI down on both organizations. 3.5 years ago, Clara continued, her voice trembling with rising emotion, the Volkovs found our shelter. They realized we were hiding the wives and daughters of men they had murdered. They paid off the local sheriff. They cut our phone lines, and they planned to burn the harbour house to the ground with 42 women and children locked inside. Brick stared at the old woman, his tough exterior beginning to fracture. What does that have to do with Grimm? Because one of the girls hiding in my shelter was the younger sister of a Hell's Angel prospect, Clara said softly. A boy named Tommy, who died for this club 5 years ago. When Arthur found out that the Russians were coming for his dead brother's sister, he didn't look away. Clara pointed a frail, shaking finger down at the ledger, resting on the frosted grass. He didn't steal your money to buy drugs, Richard. He took it to buy black market weapons, to forge passports, and to pay off the border patrol. Arthur Caldwell single-handedly relocated 42 women and children into Canada, pulling them out of the fire while you men sat in your clubhouse drinking beer. The silence in the graveyard was absolute. Not a single man moved. The only sound was the cold wind howling through the barren branches of the oak tree. But the Volkoffs weren't going to let it go. Clara's voice cracked, tears finally pooling in her eyes. They sent their top hit squad to hunt us down. 12 men with automatic weapons. If Arthur brought this to the club, if he asked you for help, the FBI would have launched a RICO investigation that would have locked every single man in this chapter in federal prison for the rest of your natural lives. Your club would have been destroyed. Clara took a step forward, her frail frame practically radiating absolute authority. So Arthur made a choice, she wept, the tears freezing on her wrinkled cheeks. He deliberately stole from you. He made himself look like a rat and a junkie, so you would disown him. So the club would have absolute, plausible deniability. And on the night the Russians came for us, Arthur went to that rail yard alone. Brick looked down at the blood-stained patch at his feet. His breath hitched in his throat. He lured them away from the shelter, Clara sobbed, falling to her knees and placing her hands on the frozen dirt of Grimm's grave. He fought 12 heavily armed cartel killers by himself, with nothing but a sawed-off shotgun and a revolver. He killed 8 of them. He broke the Volkov enforcement arm entirely, and he bled to death in the mud, completely alone, knowing that his brothers would spit on his memory for the rest of time, just so you could ride free. Clara looked up at the towering, hardened president of the Hells Angels. I sleep on this grave, Richard, because Arthur Caldwell is the only reason I am breathing. I sleep on this grave because it is the only way I can keep the bravest man I have ever known company in the dark. Brick Henderson stood completely paralyzed. The massive enforcer, a man who had broken bones with a smile and survived decades of gang warfare, felt his vision blur. Slowly, his knees buckled. To the absolute shock of the 1,000 bikers watching, the president of the Billings Hells Angels dropped to his knees in the freezing mud, directly across from the frail grandmother. He reached out with trembling, heavily tattooed hands and picked up the blood-stained leather patch. He clutched the ruined leather to his chest, bowed his massive head, and began to weep. The sight of Richard Brick Henderson, a man who had survived prison riots, barroom brawls, and decades of brutal gang warfare, weeping in the frozen mud, sent a shockwave through the perimeter of 1,000 idle motorcycles. For a long moment, the only sound in Oak Hill Memorial Cemetery was the low, rhythmic rumbling of V-twin engines and the ragged breathing of the Billings chapter president. Brick held the blood-stained Montana rocker patch to his chest like a sacred relic. It was the ultimate symbol of their brotherhood, a piece of canvas that men bled and died for, and Grimm had worn it into the absolute depths of hell. Mike Sullivan, the legendary president of the Oakland Charter, stepped out from the wall of glaring headlights. He was an older, heavily scarred biker who commanded respect across every chapter in the country. His heavy boots crunched against the frost as he walked past Brick and gently knelt beside Clara Mitchell. "May I, ma'am?" Mike asked, his voice a gravelly whisper. Clara nodded slowly, her hands numb from the cold. Mike picked up the weathered ledger. He flipped on a small tactical flashlight from his belt, casting a stark white beam over the handwritten pages. The entire graveyard held its collective breath as the Oakland president read the entries. It was all there. Every single stolen dollar accounted for. There were receipts for burner phones, deposits for armored transport vans, and payoffs to corrupt border agents. But more importantly, there were names. 42 names of women and children, complete with their new aliases and the dates they successfully crossed into Alberta, Canada. Mike flipped to the final page. Pinned to the inside of the back cover was a folded, bloody piece of paper. It was a police sketch of a Volkov syndicate lieutenant, and beneath it, written in Grimm's messy, blocky handwriting, was a final note. "The Russians are tracking Harbour House. They want a war. I'm giving them one. Keep the club out of it. Tell Brick I'm sorry for the mess." Mike closed the ledger. He swallowed hard, his jaw muscles feathering. He looked down at Brick, who was still kneeling in the dirt. "It's true, brother," Mike said, his voice carrying a devastating weight. "Every single word. Grimm took the fall for all of us. He bought those people their lives, and he bought this club its freedom, and he paid for it with his own blood." Brick slowly rose to his feet. He wiped the freezing tears from his weathered cheeks, his eyes burning with a mixture of profound grief and boiling rage. He turned to face the massive wall of his brothers. 1,000 men, hardened outlaws from every corner of the country, stared back at him in absolute silence. "Cut the engines!" Brick roared, his voice echoing off the distant tombstones. In unison, 1,000 thumbs flicked their kill switches. The sudden deafening silence that descended upon the cemetery was heavier than the noise. "Take off your cuts," Brick commanded. Without hesitation, Brick shrugged off his heavy leather vest, the patches displaying his rank and loyalty, and dropped it into the frozen mud at the foot of Grimm's unmarked grave. Mike Sullivan did the same. Then the sergeant-at-arms. Then Wyatt and Dave. A ripple of motion swept through the graveyard. One by one, 1,000 members of the most feared motorcycle club on the planet removed their colors, their most prized possessions, and laid them on the cold earth. It was a gesture of absolute, unyielding surrender, a sign of ultimate respect that had never been seen in the history of the organization. They were laying their pride at the feet of a man they had wrongly condemned. Brick turned back to Clara. The frail grandmother was shivering violently, the adrenaline finally leaving her aged body. Brick didn't say a word. He simply unbuckled his thick, fur-lined leather jacket and draped it over Clara's trembling shoulders. "You don't sleep in the dirt anymore, Clara," Brick said gently, his massive hands resting on her shoulders. "You never sleep in the dirt again. From this second until the day God calls you home, you are under the absolute protection of the Hells Angels." Wyatt and Dave, the two prospects who had tried to intimidate her just hours earlier, stepped forward. Their eyes were red, thick with unshed tears. "Let us take you home, ma'am," Wyatt whispered, his voice cracking. "Please." Clara looked down at the grave one last time. "But Arthur, he's all alone." Brick looked at the sunken patch of earth, his expression hardening into cold, unbreakable resolve. "Not anymore. I promise you, Clara. He will never be alone again." By dawn, the quiet city of Billings awoke to a military-grade operation, but it wasn't run by the police. The Hells Angels did not leave Oak Hill Memorial Cemetery. Instead, they took it over, while a heavily armed detachment of 20 bikers escorted Clara Mitchell back to her small suburban home, setting up a permanent, rotating guard detail on her front porch. The rest of the club went to work. Brick Henderson marched into the cemetery management office as soon as the sun crested the horizon. He slammed a heavy duffel bag onto the desk of a terrified Gary Hobbs. Inside was $300,000 in cash, donations collected overnight from every chapter present. "We are buying Section D," Brick stated coldly. "All of it, and we're bringing in excavators." What followed was the most spectacular act of redemption the city had ever witnessed. The club brought in a private crew of morticians and stonemasons. They carefully exhumed Arthur Caldwell's cheap pine box. They didn't move him to another cemetery. They transformed the barren, forgotten corner of Oak Hill into a fortress of honor. A week later, the club held the funeral they owed their brother. The streets of Billings were entirely shut down by the local police, who were smart enough not to interfere. Over 3,000 bikers from across the globe descended on the city. The procession was 5 miles long, a river of roaring chrome leading a custom-built, glass-paneled hearse. Grimm was placed in a solid steel casket, draped in the club's colors. But the true centerpiece of the cemetery was the monument. Where the dying oak tree once stood, the Hells Angels had erected a towering, 8-foot obelisk of polished black marble. Engraved into the stone, below the winged death head, were the words, "Arthur Grimm Caldwell, a brother, a king, a savior. He walked into the dark so we could ride in the light." Clara Mitchell stood at the very front of the crowd during the ceremony. She wore her thick wool coat, but pinned over her heart was Grimm's blood-stained Montana patch, a gift from Brick that signaled to the criminal underworld that touching a single hair on her head meant initiating a war with the entire Hells Angels nation. But the story of Grimm's sacrifice had one final, violent echo. 2 weeks after the funeral, the remnants of the Volkov syndicate caught wind that the woman who ran Harbor House had resurfaced. A Russian hitman named Yuri, the brother of one of the men Grimm had killed in the rail yard, quietly arrived in Billings. He had been tracking Clara's movements, planning to finish the job his syndicate had started 3 years ago. Yuri tracked Clara to the local grocery store. He waited in his idling sedan, watching the frail woman walk toward the entrance. He reached into his coat for his suppressed pistol, preparing to step out of the vehicle. He never made it past the door handle. The windows of Yuri's sedan shattered simultaneously as 4 massive, leather-clad men dragged him through the broken glass. Before he could even scream, a heavy boot pinned his throat to the asphalt. Brick Henderson leaned down, the chrome exhaust of his idling Harley burning the air next to Yuri's face. The biker's eyes were completely devoid of mercy. "You tell whatever is left of your bosses," Brick growled, pressing the barrel of a heavy revolver against Yuri's temple, "that Arthur Caldwell's ghost is still enforcing in this city. And if another Russian even breathes the air in Montana, we won't wait for you in a rail yard. We will burn your entire syndicate to the ground." Yuri was thrown back into his shattered car and escorted out of the state line by 50 roaring motorcycles. The Volkovs never returned. Clara Mitchell lived the rest of her days in absolute peace. She never had to sleep on the frozen dirt again, but she still visited Oak Hill every Sunday. When she did, she never walked alone. A convoy of heavily tattooed outlaws always rode behind her, standing a silent, respectful watch over the grandmother and the black marble monument. They had learned the hardest lesson a brotherhood could face: that true loyalty doesn't always look like obedience. Sometimes it looks like betrayal. Sometimes the greatest hero in the room is the one willing to be the villain, carrying the sins of his family to the grave so they can live to see tomorrow. The unforgettable truth about Arthur Grim Caldwell proves that real heroes tessely wear shining armor. Sometimes they wear scuffed leather, ride loud motorcycles, and carry the weight of the world in absolute silence. If this incredible real-life story of sacrifice, redemption, and unbreakable loyalty moved you today, please hit that like button. Share this video with your friends to keep his memory alive, and subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable dramas. Drop a comment below. What would you do? Shattering glass echoed through the desolate Nevada canyon, followed by the grinding screech of metal against asphalt. A heavy storm masked the chaos, but a lone headlight pierced the darkness, flickering just yards from an isolated clinic. Someone was out there, fighting for their last breath in the freezing mud. The wind howled like a wounded animal around the small aluminum-sided urgent care clinic in rural Washoe County, Nevada. It was 3 a.m, and the torrential rain showed no signs of stopping. Inside, Chloe Jenkins sat behind the front desk, wrapped in a thick wool cardigan, staring blindly at a glowing computer screen. Chloe was a 28-year-old nurse who had specifically requested this remote graveyard shift. Soft-spoken, fiercely introverted, and easily overwhelmed by the chaotic buzz of large city hospitals, she had sought refuge in the quiet isolation of the desert. Out here, emergencies usually consisted of late-night feverish toddlers or ranch hands with minor lacerations. She liked the quiet. She needed the quiet. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. Over the deafening drum of rain against the metal roof, Chloe heard it. A deep, guttural roar of an engine, suddenly cut short by a horrific crunch of heavy machinery, colliding with unforgiving earth. Chloe froze, her coffee cup pausing halfway to her lips. She waited for a second sound, hoping it was just a passing semi-truck hitting a pothole. But all that followed was an eerie, suffocating silence. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, spiked in her veins. Grabbing a heavy-duty flashlight and her medical jump bag, she pushed open the clinic's heavy glass doors and stepped out into the freezing deluge. The beam of her flashlight cut through the sheets of rain, sweeping across the muddy shoulder of the 2-lane highway. About 50 yards away, half buried in a ditch of twisted sagebrush, lay a massive custom Harley-Davidson motorcycle. Its front wheel was completely bent back, the chrome exhaust hissing angrily as the rain hit the scorching hot metal, and then she saw him. A few feet from the wrecked machine, a massive figure lay motionless in the mud. Chloe rushed over, her boots sinking deep into the sludge. The man was huge, clad in thick, heavy black leather that was slick with rain and mud. He was lying face down, groaning softly, a sound that barely registered over the storm. "Sir! Sir, can you hear me? I'm a nurse!" Chloe shouted, dropping to her knees beside him. The man tried to push himself up, his gloved hands slipping in the mud, before collapsing again. With all her strength, Chloe grabbed his broad shoulders and managed to roll him onto his back. He was unconscious, his rugged face bruised and streaked with dirt. He had a thick, dark beard and a jagged scar cutting across his left eyebrow. "Okay, come on. You can't stay out here," Chloe muttered to herself, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was easily over 200 pounds of dead weight, but desperation gave her strength. Hooking her arms under his armpits, she dragged him backward, inch by agonizing inch, through the mud and up the small gravel incline toward the clinic's glowing back entrance. Her muscles screamed in protest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. By the time she managed to pull him through the double doors and into the sterile, brightly lit trauma room, she was entirely exhausted, drenched to the bone, and trembling. With a massive heave, she got him onto the stainless steel examination table. The sterile environment of the clinic stood in stark contrast to the mud-caked, imposing figure bleeding on her table. Chloe immediately went into autopilot. Her shy, timid nature vanished, replaced by the rigid, clinical focus of a trained medical professional. She grabbed heavy trauma shears and began to cut away his ruined clothing to assess his injuries. The heavy leather vest he wore was soaked, but as she unclasped the front and turned him slightly to pull it off his shoulder, her breath hitched in her throat. She froze, the shears slipping slightly in her sweaty grip. Emblazoned across the back of the leather cut was a massive, intricately stitched patch, a grinning, winged skull wearing a motorcycle helmet. Above it, in bold, arching red and white letters, read the words, Hell's Angels. Below the skull, the bottom rocker read, Nevada. Chloe stepped back, her hand flying to her mouth. She wasn't naive. Growing up in the West, everyone knew the reputation of the Hell's Angels Motorcycle Club. They were the most notorious one-percenter motorcycle club in the world. The news was constantly filled with stories of their alleged involvement in organized crime, brutal turf wars, and fierce, unyielding loyalty to their Brotherhood. This wasn't just a biker who took a bad turn in the rain. This was an outlaw, a man who lived entirely outside the rules of the society Chloe so carefully tiptoed through. Panic fluttered in her chest. Her first instinct was to run to the front desk and dial 911. The police needed to handle this. But as she turned toward the door, a low, wet cough brought her attention back to the table. The man's chest heaved, and fresh, dark crimson began to pool rapidly beneath his right shoulder, staining the white paper of the exam table. Chloe rushed back. This wasn't road rash from the crash. She leaned in, wiping away the mud and torn fabric from his collarbone. It was a bullet hole. Someone had shot him. The entrance wound was small and neat, just below the clavicle. But the exit wound on his back was jagged and bleeding profusely. He hadn't just crashed. He was hunted. He had been run off the road. "Oh my God," Chloe whispered, her hands shaking as she grabbed thick gauze pads and pressed them hard against the wound. The pressure made the biker groan loudly. His heavy eyelids fluttered open, revealing piercing, storm-gray eyes. For a second, he looked disoriented, staring blindly at the bright fluorescent lights above. Then his gaze snapped to Chloe. Before she could even register the movement, his massive hand shot out, his thick, calloused fingers wrapping around her wrist like a steel vice. His grip was terrifyingly strong, stopping her dead in her tracks. "No cops," he rasped, his voice sounding like grinding gravel. He coughed, wincing in agony. "You call the cops. I'm dead." Chloe gasped, trying to pull her wrist back, but his grip didn't yield an inch. "You've been shot," she stammered, her voice trembling. "You're bleeding out. I have to report a gunshot wound. It's the law. If I don't care about your laws," the biker interrupted, his breathing shallow and rapid. "I said no cops. They're the ones who put this bullet in me." Chloe stopped struggling, staring down at him in sheer disbelief. "What? The police shot you?" "My name is Jackson," he grunted, finally releasing her wrist. He let his head fall back against the table, his face pale under the bright lights. "Jackson Miller. And if you call Sheriff Brody Hayes or any of his deputies. You'll just be calling my executioners. And maybe yours too for seeing me. Chloe's blood ran cold. Sheriff Brody Hayes was the law in this county. He was a celebrated local figure, a tough-on-crime, no-nonsense sheriff who was practically a celebrity in their rural Nevada district. The idea that he or his men were out here shooting people on deserted highways was insane. "You're a Hell's Angel," Chloe said defensively, pointing a trembling finger at the blood-stained leather vest on the floor. "Why should I believe a word you say? You're an outlaw. You're probably involved in something illegal." Jackson let out a bitter, exhausted laugh that turned into a grimace of pain. "Yeah, I'm an angel. I ain't a saint, sweetheart. I've broken my share of laws. But this time I'm the one trying to stop the bleeding in this county." He shifted, pointing weakly to his leather cut on the floor. "Left inside pocket. Get it." Chloe hesitated, her eyes darting between the wounded giant and the door. She was trapped in a nightmare. But something in Jackson's eyes, a desperate, raw honesty, pushed her forward. She knelt down, her fingers trembling as they reached into the heavy, wet leather of his vest. She pulled out a small, heavy object, wrapped tightly in a waterproof plastic bag. She peeled the plastic back to reveal a bulky, encrypted hard drive, the kind used for high-level digital security. "What is this?" she asked, standing up and holding it out. "Proof," Jackson breathed, his eyes fluttering as shock began to set in. "Brody Hayes ain't a cop. He's a cartel middleman. He's been using his deputies to escort shipments of fentanyl straight through our county. My club found out. We don't touch that poison, and we don't let it in our town. We started cutting his supply lines. Tonight, I managed to copy his digital ledgers from a drop house. Every transaction, every payoff, every name. He found out. Sent his boys after me." Jackson's eyes locked onto hers, burning with intensity. "If Hayes gets his hands on that drive, he burns the evidence. And he keeps burying this town in poison. You have to hide it. Hide me." Chloe's mind spun. This was too big. She was just a nurse who liked gardening and quiet evenings with her cat. She wasn't built for drug cartels, corrupt sheriffs, and biker wars. But as she looked at the blood soaking through the gauze on Jackson's shoulder, her oath as a nurse overrode her terror. He was a patient. He was a human being asking for sanctuary. "Okay," Chloe breathed, her voice finally steadying. "Okay. Let me pack the wound. I need to get the bleeding stopped." For the next 20 minutes, Chloe worked with feverish efficiency. She irrigated the gunshot wound, packed it with hemostatic gauze, and administered a heavy dose of broad-spectrum antibiotics and local anesthetics from the clinic's locked supply cabinet. Jackson gritted his teeth, sweat pouring down his face, but he didn't make a sound. He was remarkably tough, watching her work with a quiet, analytical gaze. "You're shaking," he observed quietly, as she tightly taped down the final bandage. "I'm terrified," she admitted, not meeting his eyes. "I'm aiding and abetting a fugitive." "You're saving a life," Jackson corrected her softly. "There's a difference." Before Chloe could respond, the clinical silence of the room was shattered by a sound that made her heart drop into her stomach. Outside the heavy clinic doors, over the relentless downpour, she heard the distinct wailing chirp of a police siren. Red and blue lights suddenly strobed violently against the clinic's frosted glass windows, casting long, frantic shadows across the examination room walls. "They're here," Jackson whispered, his hand instinctively reaching for a sidearm that was no longer on his hip. He looked at Chloe, his expression hardening. Hide the drive. Tell them I forced my way in and ran out the back. Point them in the wrong direction." "No," Chloe said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "If they find your blood, they'll know you didn't run. They'll search the clinic. You can't even stand up." "Chloe, shut up and help me get you up," she commanded, grabbing his good arm and throwing it over her shoulder. The sheer terror had pushed her into a state of hyper-focused survival. She dragged Jackson down the narrow, dimly lit hallway toward the back of the clinic. The heavy pounding on the front glass doors echoed through the empty building. "Sheriff's Department, open up!" a deep, booming voice yelled from outside. It was Brody Hayes. Chloe recognized his voice from the local radio broadcasts. Chloe hauled Jackson into the clinic's small X-ray room. She pushed him behind the heavy lead-lined barrier where she usually stood to operate the machine. "Don't move. Don't breathe," she ordered, shoving the encrypted hard drive deep into the pocket of his jeans. She sprinted back to the trauma room. It was a disaster. Bloody gauze, muddy footprints, and Jackson's leather Hell's Angels cut lying on the floor. In a frantic blur, she grabbed the blood-soaked paper from the exam table, crumpled it up, and threw it into the biohazard bin, kicking Jackson's leather vest under a rolling metal supply cart. She grabbed a mop bucket that was sitting in the corner, dumped a heavy splash of bleach onto the floor, and rapidly swabbed over the muddy footprints and blood drops. "Hello! Open the door!" The pounding grew more violent, shaking the glass in its frame. Chloe took a deep breath, smoothing down her hair and pulling her cardigan tight around her shoulders. She forced her racing heart to slow down, plastering a look of sleepy confusion on her face. She walked to the front desk, unlocked the main doors, and pulled them open. Standing on the porch, dripping wet and completely blocking the doorframe, was Sheriff Brody Hayes. He was a massive, intimidating man with a thick neck and cold, reptilian eyes. Behind him, 2 deputies stood in the rain, their hands resting cautiously on their holstered weapons. "Sheriff Hayes?" Chloe asked, keeping her voice small and trembling, exactly as they would expect from the shy night nurse. "Is everything okay? What's going on?" Brody Hayes didn't smile. His eyes immediately darted past her, scanning the empty waiting room. "Sorry to startle you, ma'am. We're tracking a dangerous fugitive, armed and extremely dangerous. He was involved in a shootout on the highway about a mile from here. We found a wrecked motorcycle in the ditch just down the road." Hayes took a slow step forward, forcing Chloe to step back into the clinic. He wiped the rain from his face, his cold eyes locking onto hers. "You haven't happened to see anyone matching that description tonight, have you, nurse?" Chloe swallowed hard, praying her face betrayed nothing. "No, Sheriff. It's been incredibly quiet tonight. I haven't seen a soul." Hayes tilted his head, his nostrils flaring slightly. He stepped further into the lobby. "Is that right?" he murmured, his heavy boots squeaking on the linoleum. He paused, taking a deep breath of the air inside the clinic. "Then why?" Hayes said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low rumble. "Does it smell like fresh blood and bleach in here?" Chloe's mind raced, her pulse pounding a frantic rhythm against her eardrums. She forced her shoulders to relax, leaning casually against the front reception desk, despite the terror threatening to buckle her knees. She met Sheriff Brody Hayes's cold, reptilian gaze, without blinking. "A ranch hand from the old Henderson estate came in about 45 minutes ago, Sheriff," Chloe lied, her voice remarkably steady. "He caught his forearm on some rusted barbed wire in the storm. It was a deep arterial laceration. He bled quite a bit in the trauma room before I could get a tourniquet on him and stitch him up. I had to use bleach to sanitize the floor. State health protocols, you know." Hayes stared at her, his jaw set. The rain drummed relentlessly against the clinic's roof, filling the suffocating silence between them. He slowly unhooked the soaking wet radio from his utility belt, never taking his eyes off Chloe. "Is that a fact?" Hayes murmured, his voice dripping with skepticism. He gestured sharply to the two men behind him. "Deputy Wyatt, Deputy Cole, take a walk through the back. Check every room, every closet. If this dangerous fugitive forced his way in, this little lady might be covering for him under duress. We wouldn't want her getting hurt." "Sheriff, I assure you, there's no one here," Chloe protested, stepping forward to block the hallway entrance. "This is a sterile medical environment. You can't just trample mud through the—" "Move aside, nurse!" Deputy Wyatt barked, a young, nervously aggressive officer with his hand already resting on the grip of his service pistol. He shouldered past Chloe, his heavy boots leaving thick tracks of mud on the pristine linoleum. Chloe's breath hitched. She followed them closely, her heart leaping into her throat as they bypassed the waiting room and headed straight down the narrow clinical corridor. Wyatt pushed open the doors one by one. The supply closet, the staff break room, the restroom. Nothing. Then they reached the trauma room. Wyatt stepped inside, his flashlight sweeping across the brightly lit space. Chloe stood in the doorway, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the doorframe. She prayed she had cleaned up enough. Wyatt walked over to the biohazard bin, nudging it with his boot. He looked down at the floor, noting the faint, pinkish hue of watered-down blood that the bleach hadn't completely erased. "She wasn't lying about the blood," Wyatt called out over his shoulder to Hayes, who was standing in the lobby. But then Wyatt's gaze drifted toward the corner of the room, toward the rolling metal supply cart. The exact cart Chloe had hastily kicked Jackson's heavy leather Hell's Angels cut beneath. One sleeve of the mud-caked, blood-stained leather was visibly poking out from under the bottom shelf. Chloe's stomach plummeted. "It's over," she thought. "He's going to see it." Wyatt took a step toward the cart. He squatted down, reaching a hand out toward the leather sleeve. Before his fingers could even brush the fabric, a sound unlike anything Chloe had ever heard shattered the tense silence of the clinic. It wasn't thunder. It was a deep, synchronized, bone-rattling roar. A mechanical earthquake that vibrated through the floorboards and rattled the surgical instruments on their metal trays. It was the unmistakable, deafening thunder of heavy V-twin motorcycle engines. Dozens of them. Deputy Wyatt jumped up, his hand flying to his gun. Sheriff Hayes rushed down the hallway, his face suddenly drained of its arrogant color. "What the hell is that?" Hayes shouted, drawing his own weapon. Red and blue police lights were suddenly overwhelmed by blinding, piercing white LED headlights, cutting through the storm, flooding the clinic's frosted windows with a brilliant, aggressive glare. The roaring engines surrounded the small building, cutting off all avenues of escape. "Sheriff!" Deputy Cole yelled from the lobby, his voice cracking with pure panic. "We got a problem out here! We're surrounded!" Hayes cursed violently, abandoning the search of the trauma room. "Wyatt, watch her! Don't let her move!" he ordered, sprinting back toward the front doors. Wyatt stood trembling in the hallway, his gun drawn, torn between watching Chloe and looking over his shoulder at the chaos outside. This was the opening they needed. Chloe backed away slowly, slipping silently into the adjacent X-ray room. Jackson was exactly where she had left him, slumped against the wall behind the heavy lead-lined barrier. His face was the color of ash, but his eyes were wide open and fiercely alert. "My brothers," Jackson grunted, his voice barely a rasped whisper. A faint, bloody smirk crossed his lips. They tracked my bike's GPS signal. I told you. Angels don't ride alone. The deputy is right outside, Chloe whispered frantically, helping Jackson to his feet. He groaned, leaning his massive weight heavily against her shoulder. We have to get you out the back fire exit while they're distracted. No, Jackson said, his good hand reaching into his pocket and pulling out the encrypted hard drive. We don't run. We end this right now. Chloe supported Jackson's weight as they limped out of the X-ray room, sneaking quietly down the corridor toward the front lobby. Deputy Wyatt had abandoned his post, retreating to the front glass doors to stand beside Sheriff Hayes and Deputy Cole. The three lawmen were staring out into the torrential rain, their guns raised, utterly paralyzed by the sight before them. Through the glass doors, Chloe could see them. At least 30 Hell's Angels had parked their massive Harley-Davidsons in a perfect, intimidating semicircle around the clinic and the 3 police cruisers. The bikers sat motionless on their idling machines in the pouring rain, clad in heavy black leather, their Nevada rocker patches proudly displayed. The sheer, overwhelming presence of the 1%er Club was terrifying. At the center of the formation stood a towering man with a thick grey beard and a bald head, holding a heavy tire iron casually in his right hand. This was Big Jim Lawson, the legendary president of the Nevada chapter. "Lawson, this is a restricted crime scene," Sheriff Hayes shouted through the cracked glass door, trying to maintain his authority, though his voice wavered. "You and your men need to disperse immediately, or I will arrest every single one of you for interfering with a federal investigation." Big Jim Lawson didn't flinch. He took a slow step forward, the rain pouring off his broad shoulders. "You ain't running a federal investigation, Brody," Big Jim boomed, his voice carrying easily over the roaring engines. "You're running a cartel pipeline, and you made the mistake of trying to run it through our backyard." "You're crazy! I am the law in this county!" Hayes screamed, his gun trembling as he aimed it at Big Jim's chest. "Disperse, or I will open fire." "You shoot me, Hayes, and you and your deputies won't make it to the edge of the parking lot," Big Jim replied coldly. Inside the lobby, Hayes was breathing heavily, panic finally setting in. He glanced around, realizing they were completely trapped. But before he could issue another order to his terrified deputies, a voice rang out from behind him. "Put the gun down, Brody." Hayes spun around. There, leaning heavily against the reception desk, stood Jackson Miller. The massive biker was pale and bleeding, but he held the encrypted hard drive high in his uninjured hand. Chloe stood bravely right beside him, her chin held high despite her trembling hands. "Jackson," Hayes sneered, his eyes locking onto the hard drive. A desperate, feral look crossed the sheriff's face. "You stupid biker trash! You think a bunch of thugs on motorcycles are going to stop me from taking that drive? I'll shoot you where you stand and burn this whole clinic to the ground." Hayes raised his weapon, aiming it squarely at Jackson's chest. Chloe gasped, stepping instinctively in front of Jackson to shield him. "I wouldn't do that, Sheriff," Jackson said smoothly, entirely unfazed. Suddenly, the wail of a different set of sirens pierced the night. It wasn't the local deputies. Massive black armored SUVs came tearing down the muddy highway, entirely ignoring the speed limits. They swerved violently into the clinic's parking lot, boxing in the sheriff's cruisers from behind. The Hells Angels calmly parted their motorcycle formation to let the tactical vehicles through. The doors of the SUVs burst open, and a dozen heavily armed men, wearing tactical vests emblazoned with DEA and FBI, poured out into the rain, their assault rifles instantly trained on Sheriff Brody Hayes and his deputies. A tall, sharp-suited man stepped out from the lead SUV. It was Federal Agent Thomas Reed, a senior director of the Regional Drug Enforcement Task Force. "Sheriff Brody Hayes," Agent Reed yelled through a megaphone. "Drop your weapons. You are surrounded by federal agents. Put the guns down now." Hayes froze. The color completely drained from his face as the reality of the situation crashed down upon him. He looked at Jackson, his mouth opening and closing in shock. You worked with the feds?" Hayes stammered, unable to comprehend the betrayal of the outlaw biker code. "I told you," Jackson smirked, his eyes flashing with triumph. "We don't let cartel poison into our town. We'll work with the devil himself if it means keeping that garbage off our streets. I copied your drive, Hayes, but I sent the decryption key to Agent Reed 2 hours ago. They've been waiting for us to flush you out." Deputy Wyatt and Deputy Cole immediately dropped their weapons, raising their hands high in the air, desperate to surrender. Hayes stared at the hard drive, then at the federal agents outside, before finally, slowly, lowering his weapon. He dropped it to the linoleum floor with a heavy thud, falling to his knees in defeat. Federal agents stormed into the clinic, swiftly cuffing Hayes and his deputies and dragging them out into the relentless rain. The reign of the corrupt sheriff was over. Jackson let out a long, shuddering breath, his knees finally giving out. Chloe caught him, gently lowering the giant man to the floor as paramedics from the federal tactical team rushed in with a stretcher. As they loaded Jackson onto the gurney, securing his wounded shoulder, he reached out with his good hand and gently grabbed Chloe's wrist. This time, his grip wasn't a terrifying vice, but a soft, grateful hold. "You didn't have to lie for me," Jackson said quietly, his storm-grey eyes locking onto hers. "You could have handed me over, kept yourself safe." Chloe offered a small, exhausted smile, pushing a strand of wet hair out of her face. "You said you were trying to save lives tonight. I'm a nurse. That's what I do, too." Jackson reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, solid silver ring adorned with a winged skull, a deeply personal token of his club. He pressed it firmly into Chloe's palm, closing her fingers around it. "If you ever need anything in Nevada, sweetheart," Jackson smiled weakly as the paramedics began to wheel him away. "You just show that to any man wearing my patch. They'll move mountains for you." Chloe stood alone in the quiet lobby, the flashing lights fading into the distance as the storm finally began to break. She looked down at the silver skull ring resting in her palm, a heavy reminder that sometimes the most dangerous people in the world were the only ones brave enough to do the right thing. What a wild, breathtaking ride. Chloe's bravery in the face of danger proves that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear scrubs and work the night shift, while outlaws can be the ones fighting for justice. If this insane true story of loyalty, corruption, and an unlikely alliance kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable, real-life stories.